안녕하십니까? 제17회 제주 포럼에 참석해 주신 여러분 반갑습니다. 지금부터 난생 처음 난민과 국민 공존과 협력의 시작 세션을 시작하겠습니다. 본 행사는 동시 통역이 제공되며 통역을 원하시는 분들께서는 자리에 놓여 있는 수신기를 착용하시기 바랍니다. 한국어 채널은 1번, 영어는 2번입니다. 그럼 이번 세션의 진행을 맡아주실 좌장님을 소개해드리겠습니다. 이번 세션의 좌장님은 아시아 평화를 향한 이주의 김영아 대표님입니다.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 17th Jeju Forum. Thank you for joining us today for the first time in refugee life, the beginning of coexistence and cooperation between refugees and the citizen. Simultaneous interpretation is available for this session. For service in Korean, set your device on channel 1. For English, select channel 2. Now I would like to hand over the stage to Kim Young-ah, Executive Director of Migration to Asia Peace, who will moderate this session. Everyone, please welcome the moderator.
Good afternoon. I'm a moderator or presider of the session. I'm from MAP, Migration to Asia Peace. I started to work for the refugees after the Refugee Act was enacted. I've been with the refugees all the time. Since then, I'm honored to moderate this session. And this session, we will be talking about the refugee, which is a global issue, and what we should do as a young generation. In ROK, we need to cooperate to tackle this issue. In 1918, we had a Yemen refugee event or scandal in Jeju. I believe that when it comes to refugee, we have to upgrade or change our perception. In order for us to live in peace with the refugees, we have to change our perception about the refugees first. Thank you for making this venue or session possible. Let me cover the agenda. We will be talking about the perception at home and abroad, how such a perception was formed. And then we will talk about how to improve the perception of refugees. Before we begin, we are going to invite Absul Wahab, who will deliver the keynote speech.
Good afternoon. As introduced, I am Abdul Wahab. I'm from Syria. I came here as a student. I lived here for 10 years, and 2 years ago I got the Korean nationality, and I am a proud Korean. And after my family has experienced many difficulties, and they live in Turkey right now after the war. For the last 12 years, I have engaged in many activities to help Syrian refugees, and I visited a lot of refugee camps, and I directly or indirectly experienced their lives. Taking this opportunity, I want to talk about their lives. In 1992, refugee-related law was accepted by Korea. The treaty was adopted by Korea, and Korea became the first Asian country to enact Refugee Act. But compared to the Western countries with long history of refugee protection, Korea still doesn't have enough protection system or enough positive perception. In this regard, in 2016, 28 Syrian refugees issued, and in 2018, Jeju refugees and Afghan refugees. All these events have made many Koreans to believe that refugee issue is actually their own issue, not other countries' issue. Refugees in Korea apply for the refugee status and to get the status, but it is not that simple. The process is very difficult, not transparent, and complicated. Getting the status is just like a miracle. Let me give you some examples. First of all, the number of officials who are in charge of the process is not many. There is no enough expertise and infrastructure as well. And documentation is also not enough. There's no enough interpreters or translators. And when refugees have their babies, they cannot have babies very freely in Korea. And occupation trainings are not provided for them, so they cannot do and they cannot do what they used to do in their home country. They just have to do some hard work in Korea. Refugee Act actions is not really fast in Korea. Only 2% of the refugees who applied for the status successfully get the status, which means Korea is very exclusive. Not only from the institutional perspective, but also from the social parts, there are a lot of difficulties, which is discrimination. Many refugees are afraid of being and living in Korea. Many Koreans are not really aware of the information of refugees, so that is why refugees are getting help from civil groups or some religious groups, and some of them on purpose try to use those refugees for their own profits. In order to help refugees from the perspective of institutions, I believe Korea should help refugees and provide more of them with the status. And the government needs to increase the number of the officials who are in charge of the process, and Anti-Discrimination Act should be introduced. The Refugee Act should be renewed to actually protect refugees. Refugees face a lot of difficulties, and they are in Korea not because they want to do so. They flee from the war. If they are sent to their hometown, then they will be at risk of dying. Korea used to be very poor in the past. Colonial rules, war, and many difficulties faced Korea, and many Koreans became refugees themselves. But the international society provided help for them, and now Korea has enough capacity to help others, especially those vulnerable people. This is a very proud achievement. Koreans have experienced those difficulties, and it's time for Koreans to help Syrians and Yemenis. They expect a lot from Koreans and refugees. some of them have to go back to their hometown and they experienced economic development and democracy in Korea. If they go back to their hometown later on, then they can also promote Korea's Korea's strengths later on, telling everyone in the world that Korea is really good at protecting human rights of refugees. Religions, nationalities should not be considered when we try and protect refugees. We need to treat well visitors, including refugees. That is the core part of Korean tradition. I want to express my gratitude to all the civil societies activities, but it is not right that refugees are just are terrorists. They are not terrorists. They should be treated well. Only some of them, only a few of them are doing some wrong things, and some people believe that all refugees are those bad people. That's not right. Some politicians try to say that refugees are bad to get there on purpose, for their own purpose, and there are also some media outlets doing the same thing. Refugees lost their homes and family, and we should not let them become another victim. Later on, when their hometown becomes stable, they will go back to their hometown. So we should treat them as a visitor so that we can set a good example in the world. As we speak today, Syria, Yemen, and many other countries in the world, there are crises emerging, especially those refugee children without any power and capacity. I hope we can provide a sense of hope for them. Thank you. Thank you very much for your remark. So you came here as a student, and later on the war broke, and your family has or separated, and now you are living in a very different life from before. But you are not just a refugee, and you are a Korean citizen, and you, as a Korean, you are working really hard to help Syrian refugees and many other refugees, which is very impressive for me. And I'm honored to have you in this session, which will make this session very inclusive and productive. Let me introduce our panelists. First of all, Professor Choi Won-gun of Kyunghee University. She is a research professor, and he established a civil group for refugees, and he's doing his study for refugees, and he wrote his doctor's degree papers in this regard, and he stressed out that a cross-border network is very important for refugees, and that's what he studied for his paper. I hope we can also get some insights in that regard from him. Please give me a big hand. Next, let me introduce lawyer Lee Il. He is from Advocates for Public Interest Law. He provides legal services and advice for refugees. regarding the Refugee Act or the containment against the refugees in Incheon Airport. For all these events, he has engaged in those events so far. Not only from the legal perspective, but also public perspective is our theme. Everyone, you don't have to be concerned about those difficult legal terms because our main theme today is public perception. And next, thank you. Next, let me introduce Mr. Lee Se-gil, and he is Commission's Associate of UNHCR representation in the Republic of Korea. He would provide us with a lot of insights about the peaceful way to accept refugees. And next, our General Director of Abdul Wahab Al Muhammad Aga. He is Help Syria's General Director and founder. It is a Korean civil group, and he is an advocate for refugees, and he himself used to be a refugee, so I believe he can provide us with a lot of insights about what he felt as a refugee himself. Please give them another big hand. Let's move on to the session. The first part of the session. As you're well aware, so who are refugees? Have you ever thought of it? From media outlets, you might have heard of refugees, and you might be very confused. They are forced migrants because of war, human rights abuse. Over the last 1 decade, the number has increased a lot, and every year the new records are made. In 2021, the number increased by 8% from the previous year. At the time, the number stood at 8.93 million, and this is the double number from 10 years ago. World Bank also announced its data. The conflicts are growing, and there are new conflicts as well in 23 countries in the world. We have a lot of big conflicts which is going on and becoming more serious. The number of population is 850 million, and the Ukrainian war, this is the fastest speed we are seeing after World War II to see the number of refugees is growing. And we also have forgotten wars, Syrian, Yemen, Afghanistan war, and there are many conflicts in Middle East as well, and refugees are exposed to human rights abuse. That is why we have more than 100 million refugees, which is 1% of the global population. They are not protected by their states, and they need protection by others. And if they have to cross border, we call them refugees. They are climate. The refugees from climate change are not included in this statistics, and that means we will see more refugees. So we have many things to do compared to the speed. We are too slow to take actions. Here we invited Mr. Lee from UNHCR, but it's not just their work. This is something that we need to take responsibility about. This is a youth session. We are called the next generation, but I don't think so. We are not the future generation. We are the current generation. We should take responsibility for the refugee issue. For the 3 days, we talked a lot about some global difficulties. We need to work together, inflation, climate crisis, and that means everyone would suffer, especially for refugees. When refugees and general public suffers, then what could you imagine the lives of refugees? I'm really concerned about their lives. Then what should we do? So this is our topic today. First of all, let me ask a question to Director Abdul Wahab. What do you think about the perception of Koreans toward refugees?
아는 사람
They do not have a good perception of refugees. They say that they are scared of the refugees. They are against the refugees. If I ask why, then they answer that there are many reasons, such as they are dreadful of the refugees, and they may lose something to the refugees, and they may take resources from them. To name a few, these are the reasons that they do not like refugees. But regulation-wise or system, we have a Refugee Act in Korea, but the act is not to help the refugees. But it's a kind of a law for the sake of the Koreans. That's what I see. I believe that you are well aware of that. It's very difficult for us to make application for the refugees, very complicated. Let's say that we have refugees who apply for that, then they just give us the forms, application form written in Korean. They are saying that you have to fill out the form even though we are not fluent in Korean, or some they do not even understand. And then the reasons should be described in the application form. And it was very difficult for us to fill it out, and there is a communication issues. We find it difficult to get the right interpreters or translators. So there is a lack of support for the refugee applicant. Once they get the status of refugee, they will start to live in a stable life. But since they are not granted the status of refugee, they feel very insecure. And if I ask a resident, why are you against the refugees? And they are saying that our town or village may be at risk of the terrorism. They are very afraid of the refugees. And refugees, too, they are afraid of the residents because they are not willing to accept, or the residents are not willing to accept them. Rather, they are isolated. And even though we are living in the same space, we feel very isolated and find it difficult to settle down. Maybe I was lucky or unlucky to see many people who are against the refugee. And there were misunderstanding about the refugees because of the cultural misunderstanding, which we need to eliminate sooner than later. And I believe that you need to enact a law or make amendment to the law so that you can prevent refugees from any discriminations and threat. There is a kind of vicious cycle that we are exposed to our regret. So in general, in summary, there is a bad perception of the refugees in Korea. Got it. Thank you. Let's talk about, he talked about the Refugee Act and the fake news, which put them at risk. I believe that it was about 30 years ago that we started to protect or make effort to protect the refugees. And out of all the panels, I believe that you are the pioneer, Professor Che. When you started to work for the refugees, did you think that the perception was the same about the refugees? It was about 2009 that you founded that organization, and back then, what was the perception of the refugees among Koreans? Has it changed or evolved or the same?
I'm a little bit embarrassed because I'm the oldest one in this panel when it comes to the activities for refugee protection. As Director Abdurrahman said, and as Director Kim Yoo said, since we joined the Refugee Convention, we enacted the act, and up until 2009 in Korea, actually there's no next to zero perception toward refugees. There was no perception at all. Of course, among civil groups, about in 2007, they saw a growing number of refugee application, and non-religious groups were required individual level or international amnesty or those refugee camps. The lawyers Kim, like lawyer Kim, there were a lot of activists who have helped us to establish the center. We got a lot of help from those civil groups, but we didn't really have any kind of feedback from the public. And the McDonald's refugees there were some Korean residents who applied for the refugee status because they lost their home. That means at the time, Koreans didn't really know what refugees are. About the perception in 2018, the Jeju, Yemen refugee events were the very important turning point in a positive and negative ways. Actually, we have always had the issue under our underground, and there are some Koreans who think that their jobs are taken by some migrant workers. And in 2018, when Jeju said that it would accept Yemeni refugees, that's when the public Korean people started focusing on this issue, creating a kind of discourse, and it is a positive one but also negative one. People started having a perception toward refugees. And as Director Abdurrahman said, after the biggest problem of 2018, one is actually caused by fake news that shows lack of perception of Koreans toward refugees. But still, we have a lot of Koreans who support refugees. As I study this field, I traced the fund for the UN. Surprisingly, in the private sector, those fund from individuals actually is larger than the fund from the government. This is a very rare case in the world. UNHCR fund from individual Koreans, and from the Korean government, if you compare the two numbers, the fund from individual Koreans is actually larger, about double. It doubles the number from the government. This is really encouraging. That means in Korea, deep inside our mind, we support refugees and advocate for refugees. We need to encourage more people to talk a lot about it more openly. That's really important, I believe. And last point, but there's limitation. For foreign refugees, we try to help them. But how about the refugees who come to Korea? They are not really familiar with those refugees. And because of fake news and because of lack of perception and the feeling that they have about refugees have become a little bit negative. Thank you. As because of time limitation, I want to ask lawyer Lee a question. What do you think? What is the background of the refugee perception?
The biggest problem is that we do not have chances to see refugees as residents, and our regulations, our policy on refugees is very harsh, strict, prevent the resident from having the chances to see refugees. Let's say that we have a new student coming from different school, and he is wearing different type of shoes and clothes, and he looks very different. But once we get mingled with him, we find that we have something in common and become friends. So I believe that we need to provide chances to see more refugees among the residents. As for my wife is a local resident of Jeju. And as for her great-grandfather, he was killed in the April 3rd crisis. So he was exposed to the national violence and lost their life. And that's what is happening in Ukraine. And Syria produced a lot of refugees. And there are many different countries where the refugees are generated. But as for the news, they are talking about the current status of the war and conflict. But what is more important is what's taking place to the people. So people's life or story is not covered by the press or media. So I believe the press needs to play an important role at least by covering the story of the refugees. I do not believe that all of us need to know about refugees because we are very busy and there are many things that we need to tackle to survive in our daily life. But as for the perception, it's the government who drives us to have a wrong conception or perception of the refugees. When the Yemen refugees came in 2018, it was very new news. And at that time, the government should be able to say that refugees are the ones we need to protect. Rather, the Minister of the Justice said that we need to protect the country from the refugees. By revising or amending the law, we will make sure that we are going to protect our society or resident from the refugees. By saying so, he planted a wrong idea that the refugees raise some threat to us or danger to us. So whenever such kind of crisis took place, the Korean government needed to take a good position to educate the general public in the positive direction. So I'm going to blame the Korean government for forming the wrong perception of refugees in the first place. Whenever I see refugees, I realize that they are just one of our neighbors. They are very similar to other neighbors. Once you get a chance to see them, you may realize it too. Without having a chance to see them, you are exposed to the news and articles, and they have formed the wrong ideas of the refugees to our regret. Thank you.
담당관님,
Thank you. Next up, Mr. Lee. What do you think about the analysis just done by lawyer Lee? Of course, regarding refugee issue, I believe there is room to be improved. And on the other hand, we have positive signs in Korea regarding refugees. I cannot say the government has made a lot of sufficient effort, but the government has definitely made some efforts. And like Professor Choi said, the donation from individual Koreans is very positive. We did our study in 2017 before the application of Yemeni refugees in Jeju. We cannot say there's a big change, but we can find some meaningful results. In 2018, 24% said yes, but the number increased to 9 percentage point to 33% who said we need to accept refugees. And there's one more result that deserve our attention. Actually, those refugees who are not economically suffering, but because of war, and 44% said that, and that number increased to 50% later on. So it is not a dramatic change, but it is still a positive change. So more people are believing that they are not economic refugees, but the refugees who came here because of war. And after 2018, there were a lot of ungrounded bad news, fake news, saying that most of the male refugees are Muslim and they would they would make the society unstable and unsafe. As it was mentioned by Professor Choi, actually before 2018, this issue was not addressed publicly, but we can say it is a positive because after 2018, the issue garnered a lot of attention from the public, and 4 years later, today, we have Yemeni refugees, but we cannot see any kind of evidence that they cause them problems. Rather, they live in harmony with Koreans. To sum up, about refugee issues, we still have to be improved further, but we still need to see positive signs in Korea. That's what I think. Thank you for your comments. So let me wrap up for the first part. So we talked about the perspectives toward refugees and what are the backgrounds of the perception. It was mentioned that there is a sense of hope, of some positive signs, but there are still a lot of challenges before us. So In the part 2, we want to explore some ways to resolve the problem and enhance our perspective. So we don't have a long time, so please make it short. So what should be our future direction to have positive, better perception? We have Mr. Lee from UNHCR and lawyer Lee, and also the refugee itself, Mr. Abdul Wahab, and professor as well. So we can discuss this topic. Could you introduce your what your organization is doing, Mr. Lee?
As for UNHCR that we are working for, we are trying to educate people so that they can have a positive view or right view of the refugees. As for the Korean representative, we create a movie about the refugees, at least one per year. We have many different situations, a crisis that the refugees are in. However, the press does not cover their stories in details. So I think that we are making an attempt so that we can present their stories to help the public better understand the refugees. It's a kind of documentary film. And as for the refugees, we talk about the problems in statistics. The number of first refugees as of this year, it's more than 100 million. Last year it was 89 million or more than that. Let's say we have a 100 million, then we have a 100 million stories, different stories, which should be known to the public, people. And through the documentary or film, we try to deliver the stories behind the figures to make more convincing, understandable. Let me introduce some of them. Last year, we created 2 movies. First is about the refugees living in Korea, what kind of background they have, and what life they have in Korea. It's called A Record. And Lawyer E is starred in that movie and talk about the perspective that we should have about refugees. And last year, refugees and those people who are adopted abroad, and then those people who are naturalized like Abdul Wahab, they have a strong kind of question of their real identity. So the title of the movie is The Sense of Belonging. And he is starred in the movie too. So up to now, we have created or made 6 movies in total. And we also had an online film competition with the Diaspora Film Festival. And every June, on the Day of the Refugee, we have a refugee movie festival. We entered that competition too, so that we can spread the stories of the refugees as much as possible.
It is very impressive to make a lot of films. And Director Abdul Wahab, what do you think we need to? What kind of effort do you think we need to make to improve the perception about the identity and sense of belonging? I had an opportunity to feel that sense of belonging when I have close friends who take care of myself. And I also felt the same thing while I met a lot of refugees. In order to feel the sense of belonging, we need several things. First of all, legal difficulties should be resolved. The refugee process, application process should be shortened with more transparency so that refugees can be granted refugee status to live in this society in a very stable way, and so that they can get education, training, or many other things. And they also want to interact with many people in a social way. They are not just a refugee, and they want to be seen as a neighbor, not as a refugee. They are not asking for more benefits. They just want to live in the society on their own. They don't really know when they can come back to their hometown, but still they want to live in this society on their own, based on their own capacity. That requires two efforts. Korean people should open their mind to interact a lot with refugees, and as Lawyer Lee said, there is no chances for many Koreans to meet them. So Koreans can try and visit those festivals, and I believe there should be more study on refugees, not only from me but also from other refugees. Koreans can do some research on their own. And refugees, of course, they also need to make a lot of effort. Of course, if they are given the status, they should follow the law. But even if they are not given the status, they should also try hard to follow the Korean rules. And regarding the Korean language, they should be given more opportunity to learn Korean. This is also the role of the Korean government and also of civil society. Thank you. And next up, Professor Che, please.
저는
Let me make a comment. Recently, in the international community, one of the general trends in 2008, there is a global compact for refugees. With the system in place, we have identified some keywords. One of them is a whole of society approach. Whenever we think of the protection of refugees, we think that that's the role of the states and international organizations. I mean, they should protect the refugees, not the individuals. But there was a limitation. That's why they came up with the whole of society approaches. Because the society need to share their power to protect the refugees. Not only public sector, but also the private sector need to cooperate to protect the refugees. Educational institutions and NGOs, of course, should be included. But in addition to them, development and human rights or humanitarian organizations, support organizations, and other type of organizations or private sectors, and even individuals can be engaged. Once the private sector is involved actively to support the refugee community, I believe that they can stand on their own much faster. So this is an area that we need to spend time talking about or thinking about. And we have a complementary pathway. And as for the refugees, we have to help them to resettle, but at the same time, UNHCR, one of the person who granted refugee status, let's say that he wanted to study further to get a bachelor degree or master degree, then they may invite those people as a student and give them chances to study. And while they study, they give the refugee status automatically. So it can be applied to the labor market. And let's say that we have a refugee community consisting of 5 to 10 people, and they can fund a single refugee coming out of the area which is involved in the conflict so that they can give them a chance to stay. So there are many attempts that we can make. Abdul Amin, he is almost finishing his doctorate degree. We have a number of students coming abroad to Korea to study. And we have, like, if we allocate some quota of the foreign students to the refugees, like 1% of the total foreign students, or even 0.1% from the starting point, I believe that it's going to make a meaningful difference at the beginning. In Japan, Japan Christian University, Hitochi, or Meiji University, they are starting to implement such a program. And along with the UNHCR, with a university in Seoul, they are planning to launch such a program. Sorry that I'm not able to open that information public to you, but if we spread such efforts and attempt, then we will kind of make certain difference in the world.
예, 모든 영역에서
In all areas of society, all groups around the world can work together to have better results. I think that is why the local societies, communities are really important because they are the one who can identify refugees. And this is the last part. Lawyer Lee, in order to improve refugee perception, could you introduce some of the legal efforts that we can make or beyond legal perspective? I think we can change the question, improving perception towards refugees. We don't have to do that a lot because I don't really believe Koreans don't like refugees. Then what should we do? We need to find some opportunities so that they can feel solidarity with refugees. Because as I told you earlier, the government sent some wrong messages and media outlets as well. But Koreans do not really believe in those information. Then, do you agree with refugee exception or not? Actually, this question is wrong. Can you disagree with accepting disabled people or women? That's not they are not acceptable questions. And how about refugees? We can change the question. Refugees are at risk. Then do you agree if we can send them to their home country? Then 70% of the respondents say we should not. Then I think that's the real perception of Koreans toward refugees. Then we need to make sure that the government doesn't deliver the wrong information or media outlets deliver wrong information. And in our society, politicians tend to utilize their status to get their own benefits. For example, women or refugees as well. And they say that you are suffering because of those refugees. And the same thing goes for the US. And these are the bad practices. In Korea, we don't really have that kind of bad practices, just like the US did, but we should prevent this kind of practices in advance in Korea. And actually, Koreans don't really think refugees are bad. So we need to prevent those practices in advance from happening. We should understand their sufferings, and we need to share their stories with a lot of Koreans. I told you My grandfather-in-law suffered from the Jeju April 3rd upspring. And my grandmother as well. She also suffered from war. And my mother is her second name is Peng, and those with the second name Peng are all from China, and they are actually refugees from China. So that means my mother used to be refugees, but they are accepted. Every one of us have many different stories that allow us to understand refugees, but there are some bad news, fake news, and negative information about refugees and media outlets, and we should stop them from doing that. So we should tell people there are many people suffering from the Syrian war, and we can ask citizens, do you want to meet those Syrian people if you can? So I believe it's the government's fault, not the Koreans' fault. So it is not about the law or legal perspective. Thank you for your answer. Because of time limitation, we have only about 24 minutes. So this is the end of the second topic. I think many of the panels actually want to add more comments. Anyone?
네,
I'm going to ask a very simple question. I've been working with the UNHCR for a bit over 2 years, which means that I have some chances to see the refugees and have discussion or conversation with them. As for UN international organizations or civil organizations who support the refugees, what are the best approach for them to approach the refugees? Or what shall we do to improve the perception of refugees? Any good idea? Who is willing to answer the question? Can I? Yes. I can speak Arabic. So as for Arabic refugees, if you go to immigration office or civil organizations, and they get enough information or counseling from them, and they contact me and ask question. Can you summarize? But you are briefed. But how come you asked me to summarize? And they said that they deliver me facts, but I do not fully understand whether I understood correctly. And they were explaining in the layman's term, and they believe that because of the language barrier, they got the feeling that they try to explain it too easily and treating them like a babies who just started to learn language. So they believe that they are being treated like an idiot or too stupid. So they raised the complaint that I just want them to see as just people, not a poor refugees or the loser or somebody who has failed. Just consider me as another human being, a par with others. That's what they complain most, especially those who are from Syria. So what I want to deliver is this. Just explain things to the Syrian people in a way that you do to Koreans. What about you?
말씀하고 싶으신 거죠?
You can add some comments. Professor Choi. So it is irrelevant to the question. Anyone who want to answer the question? I meet refugees every day and work hard to solve some problems, and I got to look back on myself, and in many cases I just make my decision by myself, and in some cases I myself also try to make things simple, and I just don't deliver some specific information for them because I was afraid of them being very concerned or dreadful about the Korean society. But what we need to do is not to avoid the situation. And they also say you should try to change the situation rather than saying that we should accept the situation. Okay, please. I will make it very short. In the Korean society, when you talk about refugees, their rights, we actually talk a lot about the constitution regarding refugees, but we need to turn this attention to other things. The if you look at the clause 14 of World Human Rights Announcement, it says that all human beings have the right to seek asylum and enjoy asylum. That means when we provide support for refugees or when we engage in activities from the civil group society, we focus too much on the right to seek asylum. But we should turn our focus on their right to enjoy asylum. So we need to make sure they can enjoy their life in Korea. That's what I think what we need to work on. So we need to make sure all institutes, all groups, all women-related groups or local centers, those educational institutes should work together as a whole. As Professor Che said, there are many different occupational experts, and many people are very sensitive to their emotions, and many people feel quite new to refugees, but actually many Koreans are very acceptable, are turned out to be very acceptable to refugees. We can work even harder together, but as Lawyer Lee said, sometimes media outlets send us some confusing information, and those who are the person in charge of the refugee process, some of them actually say that refugees are just workers and refugees are bad people, which is very unfortunate. So we need to have occupational ethics to have healthy relations with refugees, and vice versa. Refugees should also do the same thing so that they can live in harmony in our society. That concludes our free discussion. And lastly, I want to get into the Q&A session. First of all, any questions from the floor?
Put the mask. Do you consider that there is a difference for the citizens, common citizens, about the perception between refugees and immigrants? Do you think that there is a difference, or for them it's exactly the same thing? Because I am, well, as far as I understood, the refugees that you were talking about, for example, they're from Syria. But what about the immigrants? The economic immigrants, if you want, from China, for example. Is this for the perceptions of the citizens is the same? or is different?
혹시 어디 소속이신지 말씀해 주실 수 있을까요?
Could you introduce yourself?
From Mexico. So we receive a lot of immigrants that, well, of course, refugees, but this is a small amount of refugees and thousands of immigrants from Central America.
네. 그래서 난민과 이주
So, are there differences between the perception toward refugees and immigrants? This is a very impressive question. Actually, many migrants, specific groups, they don't really know a lot about refugees, and even those people don't really know a lot about the background of refugees. So they don't really have any idea about how they should treat refugees. So we can talk about if there are any differences between the perception towards refugees and immigrants. Anyone who can answer the question? I will try and answer the question. This is my personal opinion as an activist. Actually, in Korea, there is no big difference between the perception between the refugees and immigrants. I think things would be very different in Mexico, but Korea has the population of 50 million people, and only about 250,000 migrants are living in Korea. The number is very small, about 5%. Actually, many Koreans don't really know the number, because those migrants many of them are from China. There are Korean Chinese, or there are some students, but many of them are those workers in building construction. So many Koreans don't really have any kind of opportunity to meet them in their reality. Only a few people. Actually, the number of refugees in Korea's ranking is about 130th, which means it's next to zero. We have only about 4,000 people who have been given the refugee status. So we don't really have any kind of distinguished perception toward refugees and immigrants as well. So what we need to do as a civil group is that we should tell Koreans we have this much immigrants, and we should introduce them to the migrants, and they need our attention, and refugees as well. But to answer your question, we don't really have any specific perception against refugees or immigrants, which are distinguishably different. So we should we should work harder to tell people both of them are part of our society. Did my answer your question? Actually, refugees and immigrants, Koreans don't really think they are different, and I think they should not be treated as in a different way. So depending on the visa type, some people can get the facial mask, but some cannot. And those with certain visa who married a Korean, they can get the government funds for COVID-19. So we have many different kind of categories and distinguish those different people. But that's not the right practice, I believe. We need to understand the special situation facing refugees. We should check if they survived from war, if they suffer from any kind of gender-based violation, because they have different experiences and they should be treated. We need to understand their background. We, of course, need to provide them support. And as for migrants, we have a great support program, but as for refugees, we don't really have enough support system. So institutionally, we have different approach for refugees and migrants. So I can say public perception between for the two groups is not different, but the institutional system is different for them, for the two groups.
Any more questions? Thank you. I'm with the Jeju University. My name is Ko Jun-sung, and Lawyer E said that back in 2011 in Afghanistan, we took them out of Afghanistan, but they were not treated as refugees, or rather, they were taken as those people who made contribution to Korea. I believe that what government did was not right. We should take refugees for refugees. But as for the expression that they used, they tried to use a different term rather than calling them refugees because we got the wrong idea, or wrong perception of the refugees in the first place. So in order to correct the wrong perception that we have in our society, what shall we do, or what should we do? Sorry, I am very talkative. Well, let me try to answer your question. You hit the point. Very good comment. However, what the government did was wrong. It was a very, very good opportunity to correct what was wrong. Back in 2018, we didn't know about the Yemen that much, but after for Afghanistan, Koreans are relatively well aware of that. It is under the attack of Taliban, and women and children are very vulnerable. So they have to explain that they are refugees who need to be given the refugee status. And it was a good chance for us to correct the wrong perception of the refugees. That's right. And as for the Korean expression that they used, they said a special contribution. They were branded as people who made a special contribution. So let's simply call it special contributor rather than refugees. It got the wrong impression that only those people who made some contributions or who get a very good strengths, they can be given a right to live in Korea as a kind of gift. So they just distorted the perception or the kind of definition of refugees. However, I believe that it is the people or public who can change the things. And let's say that, and sorry that I didn't deliver my full information. As for the government system, it's very wrong. They just put them in a closed place and separate among family members. It's very wrong. The civil societies need to convince the government, and they need to make complaint about the way that the government treats the refugees. Whenever they raise the issue and make it as a public opinion, I believe that they can change the government, its attitude. So your question was very right. You hit the point. And they try to not to use refugees to take those people from Afghanistan. And if I ask the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs, they say that it is the Ministry of Justice who coined the word. And if I ask the same question to the Minister of Justice, they say that it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who coined the word, to our shame. But to be proud of being Korean citizens, I believe that we have to make our voices heard as the civil or resident or Korean citizens. Yes. It's really sorry to hear what has happened. They just took measures case by case. Last year in Myanmar, there was a coup d'etat, and all of the residents in Myanmar, they were refugees. And at that time, the Korean government said that do not apply for the refugees. We will grant you a different status. So those people who are granted a special status from there, they are not counted in the statistics and figures. Any other questions from the floor?
부터 듣겠습니다.
Hello, I'm a student of the Youth Secretariat of Jeju Forum. And I actually searched the internet to understand the perception, and many people say that the tax revenue should not be spent for the foreigners, and they take our jobs. So I can say that there is a structure of conflict between Koreans and refugees. And do you think what do you think can be some ways to resolve this conflict, like job creation for refugees? I think you already suggested the solution. And we have one more person who raised the hands. And could you ask the question? I am Hyun Dong-hak from Jeju University, and I study refugees. The biggest problem is that the biggest challenge we have is the refugees with humanitarian status. Now, the thing is that they are very concerned. Why? Because the ceasefire has been maintained for a very long period of time, and they are very afraid of their future when they have to leave Korea, because they only have the humanitarian status, and many of them are from Malaysia, and they are from Yemen, but actually it was 2015, so they lived in Malaysia for 3 years, and they came to Jeju. And except for 2 people, all the people from the group were granted the humanitarian status. And this is a similar question to the Mexican lady. So can we say, so we need to make sure that if they are economic refugee or other types of refugees. Any panelist who can answer the question? It's a conflict between Koreans and refugees, so we can create jobs for them. This can be a solution. And another question is about, so we have the humanitarian refugees in Yemen. I think the 2 questions are both very hard to answer. About the comments on the internet. So there is a conflict between Koreans and refugees, and many people pay attention to this, and this is the frame. I think this is a wrong perception itself. It is not right to think that refugees are bad people for Koreans. This is not about actually nationality. Every country has responsibility to take care of refugees, because anyone in the world can become a refugee. And the entire world should take responsibility, just like we have our own system to prevent some kind of disaster. All countries have the mandatory to share the burden to take care of refugees. This is everyone's responsibility. So we should not separate refugees from Koreans. Rather, we should understand we are all human beings, the same human beings. That is why I talked about the word human rights announcement. The right to seek asylum is the most basic right that any human being should enjoy. And regarding the second question, those Yemeni people with the humanitarian status, I think this is the most representative example that the Korean government took the status very mistakenly. The ceasefire from the Afghan history, we can see there were a lot of ceasefire and conflict. Then, when there is ceasefire, of course, the government can make some decisions to provide the humanitarian status by themselves from the legal perspective. But we need to understand that what the government did was the wrong thing. And I believe those refugees have very complex situation. Of course, they are part of refugees, but I believe what refugees face is just a reality. And this can become everyone's story. If you become a refugee, you should choose a country, and you have to think many things, many complex things. And we need to make sure our policies for refugees should consider this complexity. And we should have more human-like policies for refugees. Thank you.
Time is up, so let me wrap up today's session. If you stay behind, we may have further discussions. Today we had a session on the refugees and the beginning of a coexistence and cooperation between refugees and citizens. I believe that the session was very meaningful. We will continue to have these venues in the future, and we have refugees and children, the elderly people, and we have refugees from different backgrounds. We want them to be present in this kind of meeting later on so that we can find a ways coexistence. That will be the first place. And doing so, we will find better way to coexist in the future. Thank you for organizing this session. With this, I'd like to conclude today's session. Thank you.